The last work that we're going to look at in our course is Alan Donagan's Theory of Morality, which was written in 1977, or published in 1977. And this is a modern book on morality that draws heavily on the thought of Immanuel Kant, but discusses the issues in contemporary context. And so we're now in the 20th century with a theory of morality that may well work for the 21st century as well. And that's what Donagan thinks he's put together. Now, I want to make a bit of a challenge to you as you study Donagan's theory of morality, and that is the challenge that he really thinks that he has a theory of morality that will work in the world. And so I propose that you take that challenge and consider whether the account that Donagan gives can perhaps change your mind and your thinking with regard to precisely how morality should work in the world. In contrast to the other people that we've looked at, Donagan's theory of morality, again, is something that he thinks will work in the world. And so I want to examine it very carefully. If you find something that is incorrect in this, or wrong in some way, then I ask you to speak up, and also to take the challenge upon yourself, to think about whether you should change your attitude, change your ways of thinking, from one to another, whichever way you like and you think is appropriate, by the use of your own intellectual evaluation of what you're reading. So I'm asking you again, challenging you to think about it very, very carefully, because I think he has a great deal to offer here. And I find it a very fitting conclusion to the course. He will be talking about a number of things that are very important. I think I've already told you that he's going to discuss the issue of suicide and whether there are situations in which suicide is morally permissible. I didn't say obligatory, but morally permissible. And a number of other considerations, too. We'll also be talking in detail about the issue of sexual ethics with regard to Donagan. And let me state right up front that Donagan's theory of morality here, as we will see shortly, draws on the Hebrew Christian tradition, but not for any conceptions of God or for theology, but rather because these traditions have studied in detail human morality and debated it for centuries. So Donagan thinks that there is a fundamental moral theory that can be pulled out of that material, or at least the parts of a moral theory that can be pulled out of that, and leaving aside the question of whether God exists or not, there still can be a theory of morality put forward and drawn out of the Hebrew Christian tradition, put forward by Donagan in this book. And what exactly that means we'll see in the next couple of chapters on this. So let's begin then with this, the very beginning of the chapter here, the first chapter, and that is the concept of a theory of morality. Now, theory is an account that may or may not work, and we've looked at various theories of morality so far with Aristotle and Kant and Mill, and also we looked a bit at Islamic religious ethics and other things as well. So for now, then we want to just figure out what is a concept of a theory of morality? What's that really about? So the theory is to give an account of something and how it fits together in a coherent way. And so that very concept, what is the theory of morality a theory of? Well, it's a theory of customary mores, or ways of acting in a society. So those customary mores or customary values found in a society will be the foundation for what the theory of morality is. And so it's reflecting what people actually do. One of the things that we find in Aristotle, which I didn't emphasize when we looked at Aristotle, was the notion that the primary values in Aristotle come from his culture. And he has the view that the primary values of what it means to be courageous and what it means to be temperate and that sort of thing, those notions are defined by a particular culture in its cultural context. So these customary mores will be customary mores in a particular society. In the case of our own society, then we're looking at a first world society that happens to be American in this case, but a first world society where there are certain notions of rights and values that are not found in many other countries. So that's what the customary mores are. Now, he talks about Stoics and universality, and he does so in the context of figuring out what is essential to a theory of morality. And according to Donagan, then, what is essential is universality. That is, a theory of morality must apply to all human beings, and it must apply in a suitable way to all human beings. Recall that with regard to Aristotle, Aristotle's theory of morality was not for all human beings. It was primarily a theory of morality set out for aristocratic males. And we saw this with regard to the feminist critique of Aristotle, but it was even more broad because for Aristotle, slaves don't have the same value as other human beings and are really not participants in morality. Rather, they're told what to do. So the Stoic philosophers wanted to set aside all of that. Pardon me. They wanted to set aside all of that, and they wanted to say that, in fact, it applies to all human beings. And in doing so, they drew upon their physics, or their cosmology, one might say. So the Stoic notion is that God is not a person or an individual in some way, but God is the power and the fire that moves all things in the universe. And of course, heat is necessary for things to grow, and heat is necessary in the human body and in other animals as well, for them to live and to move and to act. And so they took the notion that each human being gives evidence of having a spark of the divine in them, insofar as they are able to use their reason and to think, and even to develop science and other things develop out of their rational abilities. And when they looked up at the sky, they saw stars with light, and the light of the stars seemed to be caused by heat or fire, and so they said that in fact the heavens were fire, and what was moving all things is fire, and that is God. So the conception of God is that God is the fire that moves all things, or as we might say, energy today. Energy is what moves all things, and that is God. Now, what they also observed in looking at the heavens and the change of seasons and other things, they observed regularity, and that regularity was law-like for them. So the Stoics said that there's a kind of a law in nature, a kind of natural law by which all things act. And that natural law is the law of God, because everything moves in accordance with the divinity inside of it, the presence of the divine inside of it, including human beings who, again, have reason as the spark of the divine in them. And that spark of the divine in human beings, reason, enables human beings to see what the laws of the universe are by means of their reason, and to see that these laws govern all of nature, all of reality in that sense. So for the Stoic philosophers, then, a couple of new things are introduced here. First of all, there is a universality with regard to morality. It counts for all human beings, all healthy human beings, let us say, and other human beings perhaps have less of the light because of mental illness or other issues or physical disabilities, etc. But all human beings have value, and this is found to be quite different from what we have in Aristotle. So universality is essential to it. And essential then also is the notion of natural law for the Stoics, because the natural law are the laws that govern the universe, and those laws are put forward by God in the regularity that God or fire moves all things. Now, Donagan says that he's going to study the notion of morality using materials from the Hebrew Christian tradition. In the Hebrew Christian tradition, there is a notion of natural law and the lawgiver. The lawgiver is God, who is personified, that is depicted as a person, speaking commandments and giving commandments to the Israelites, and also giving law to human beings in accordance with the covenant that was made with Abraham. So God is the lawgiver in this context, and God has made things the way God wants things to be, and so God is the one who, so God has made things to be the way that God chooses them to be, and the binding force of moral law then is found in the fact that God has given law and natural law to all things, made them as the natures that God wanted, and to act contrary to the natural law that God has enacted. God is the lawgiver for the universe and also for human actions. And to act contrary to that is to act contrary to God and contrary to the moral law that God has put forward with regard to all human beings. So that's the Hebrew Christian tradition. And of course, the moral law is for all human beings, and it's binding on all, and so it's universal as well. Although some interpretations had it to be only for the Israelites, but we're not going to get into that right now. So this is the notion of natural law. And now all Donagan is doing here is being descriptive about what's going on in his approach to morality. So he's going to draw upon the Hebrew Christian tradition, and because he thinks there's a philosophy in there. Key elements of a philosophy are found in that tradition, and not because they are Hebrew or Christian in the sense that they involve belief in God. And be very clear about that. Now, Donagan spells out in the rest of chapter 1, he spells out different kinds of theories relating to morality. And he rejects a number of them. One of the theories that he rejects is the notion of morality as a disposition of affection and conduct. So affection, you know from our study of Mill, affection means feelings. And so it's a disposition of the feelings of people and conduct. And he cites George Friedrich Hegel here. And Hegel had the notion that truth and right are constantly changing. And they're to be found in the feelings that people have at a certain time and a culture has at a certain time, and the way it conducts itself. So for Hegel, what is morally right or morally wrong changes with the times. In contrast to Kant, who held that all human beings have intrinsic value at all times, Hegel thought that this changes. So slavery was the right thing at one time, now it's not the right thing. Oppression of women into various roles and excluding them from leadership was a right thing at one time, and now it is not. So what's true, right, and good changes with the times. And so the absolute truth is something that human beings are and all reality is moving toward more and more. Now, Hegel distinguishes between Moralität and Sittlichkeit. And Sittlichkeit is what Hegel has in mind, with a constantly changing feelings and conduct with regard to morality. Moralität is something different. Moralität is morality as something stable and fixed, more along the lines of Kant. Now, in this context, as you know from your reading, he discusses Franz Jägerstätter, who was drafted into the German army in the Second World War, the Nazi army, and he refused to go. He consulted with local bishops, and local bishops said that he should just go with the flow, that is, go with the affection and conduct of the times, that is the general approach that's found at the time in German culture. So he should go ahead and join the army, even though he was convinced that, in fact, it was an immoral war at the time, an immoral war of conquest. So Jägerstätter was very disappointed in his advice from bishops and religious authorities, who said that he should enlist and go along with what the current values were at the time, and instead he refused, and for that he was executed. So Jägerstätter, in his refusal to partake in the Nazi aggression across Europe, in fact is a hero because he stood up for certain absolute values. And so what Donagan wants to make very clear is that Jägerstätter, who took a side with Moralität, that is, it's stable and, as it were, eternal values of morality. Human beings always have intrinsic value, and all human beings too, not to exclude Jews, etc., as happened. Then Jägerstätter said that right and wrong are something permanent, and they always involve respect for rational beings, etc., as we've seen in Kant. So, is Donagan going to have this notion of changing truth and changing morals all the time? No. The intrinsic value of human beings is always present in all times, and human beings, in greater and lesser extent, respected these. always imperfectly, I suppose, but they, to greater and lesser extents, respected the values of human beings. But the standard itself and what was right was always the same. It's an internal value, so to speak. Okay, now another. But he's not going to pursue that theory. That's not what he's doing in his book. Not the theory that's of Hegel. That's a matter of affection and conduct. Another theory that he is not using is intuitionism. Now, what is intuitionism? It's the notion that somehow you just feel or just know what is right in a particular moral context. So some people have said human beings must in some way, either a simple way or a much more complex way, in some way have the ability to apprehend and know what the right thing is. And the term for this was used as a kind of intuitionism. So if something is proposed, then one would just would intuit what is the right kind of thing to do. The problem with intuitionism, whether it be in the new or the old form, is that people make various claims and they can't ground the claims firmly. There's nothing firmly to ground them in except human psychology of intuition, or which remains rather mysterious. So this causes a great number of problems. This, too, is not what Donagan is doing. So intuitionism is not the kind of thing that he's doing in this book. He's not saying that you somehow just know in certain circumstances what is morally right. So it's excluding that as well. So those two have been excluded. So what he is doing then, as I indicated earlier, is he's going to have a philosophical interest in the Hebrew Christian moral tradition. Why study this Hebrew Christian moral tradition? You study it because of the many years of discussion, back and forth, and reflection that has taken place in the Hebrew and Christian traditions of theology and philosophy to determine what is the right thing for human beings. So there's been a great deal of rational study of this. Fine. How to study it now? Well, you study it by leaving aside the specifics with regard to the existence of God and just focusing in on key notions that have been discussed in the tradition, notions that have emerged from the tradition and the discussions as values for human beings with regard to morality. So moral values come out of this. So he then spells out for you what the investigation proposes. And this is on page 29 of your books. And so I'll go through this slowly with you because we want to be very clear on what he's doing. He says this investigation will fall into two parts. In the first, he says, I shall try to develop as a philosophical system that part of common morality according to the Hebrew Christian tradition which does not depend on any theistic belief. So he thinks he can pull out key values from the discussion in the tradition and make them stand alone as philosophical values for a common morality. He goes on, in the second, I shall investigate the truth of that system, partly by examining the external objections that have been made to it, chiefly from the consequentialist point of view. Consequentialist is Mill again, and partly by exploring considerations on which its first principle has been put forward. Let me translate that for you then. So he's going to see whether the system works, whether it gives us a true and coherent system. And we are going to skip the chapter where he talks about Mill and consequentialism because it doesn't contribute to in a positive way to what his investigation is. But first then, he's going to see whether the system is true in relation to external objections. But then also, he says, by exploring the considerations on which his first principle is put forward, he's going to look at the foundations for it then, very, very carefully. And he's also doesn't have it right here, but he's also going to test it for internal consistency as well as being consistent with what we think morality should be in an external way for all human beings. So that was chapter 1 of his theory of morality. And I'm going to stop here. There was a short video. I'm going to stop here. And the next video will continue with chapter 2, presuppositions and principles.